Hey, how's it going? So this is going to be, I think it's 9 builds that we're only going to spend 2 minutes on. So if I go over 2 minutes, I'm literally going to cut off the video and stop yapping, and we're just going to go to the next one. Sorry. I know people usually look for really in-depth things, but most of these are going to be things that I thought about for video ideas that didn't really make the cut for one reason or another. Some of them are just not very good. Some of them are good, but are too simple to like really talk about. And then some of them are just kind of like weird things that I ran into that I kind of wanted to talk about very, very quickly. So here we go. Okay, first showcase, Magnus Prime. This is a good weapon. 2 main gimmicks. Deadly maneuvers. This is multiplicative crit. It multiplies your crit by this 400% after everything else. Chamber Cascade, which is a separate thing, which just gives you ammo efficiency basically permanently, as long as you can start to stack it. My Riven is insane for especially the trait here. Not really deadly maneuvers itself. If you're using deadly maneuvers and you want to make this weapon really pop off, just use Acuity with it. But if you want to work on the Chamber Cascade thing, it is worth noting that fire rate is good on a Riven because it almost gets you to the fire rate cap that this has. This is a semi-auto weapon, so its fire rate is capped at 10, which is not something I really knew before I started playing with this weapon, but yes. And then on top of that, we're running Sight as a weapons platform here, so I have Nourish over R4, which generally I would not recommend, but for this build specifically, I think it's pretty fun. So resupply, we're going to be using heat ammo and blast ammo for the most part. So blast if you're AoE clearing, and then if you're doing single target, you do heat. You use the punch through from Seek to get more bullet hits so that we proc our passive more often. This is the build that I'm actually running for this version of Sight, but this doesn't necessarily mean that this is exactly what you should be running. It's also worth noting that this passive does multiply with deadly maneuvers. So these two things together end up being pretty good, all things considered. That's kind of why we're running Sight here, is because deadly maneuvers is especially fun with it. The way this build actually works in practice is that we have our enemies out, you switch to heat ammo, and then you make sure you're invisible so that Arcane Creps actually goes off. And you can see that even before we have any stacks here, this is already starting to like almost one-shot. Heavy Gunners. And then if we manage to get an ammo proc here, now this is a full auto weapon. This dex build's a little scuffed in like not a good way. So what I'm going to be showing off here is Flashing Bleed, this final evolution here, and combined with Furax body count and then Relentless combination. If you're looking at this and thinking, oh god, what are you cooking? I would agree. This build ends up being actual ass. It's so bad, but it's too funny to like not show off. So let me do that real quick. Basic idea here. If you kill something with the Furax, even with like a slam attack like this, you can see that it puts 5 stacks of blast and also 5 stacks of impact on everybody around. So I'll kill this guy. Let's actually kill this guy. You can see we got a bunch of 1s on everybody, and then it got those impact stacks. And it turns out those impact stacks can actually proc slash also, as long as you have that final evolution and you're fully stacked on Furax race. So now that we're actually in Incarnon mode, you'll see that when I kill something, that we actually get slash effects on some of these people, right? So you see that slash on a couple of these enemies. That's what we're cooking here. So we kill an enemy, it applies slash to enemies around us, and then you can see that our combo is actually ticking up. So we don't just sit at the normal combo for a slam build, we just tick up like this instead. This also ends up being so bad. It's like so not good. So I was originally trying this with Influence. I actually don't think Influence is the best thing that you should be running here. You should probably be running something like Exposure, because Exposure actually will increase our damage quite a bit, and we don't really care about the radius of it that much as we care about the explosion happening and then giving it a bunch of combo, right? One thing worth noting here that I haven't really talked about yet is there are a lot of buffs that will just disable the interaction from working entirely. I think it's mostly because for whatever reason, this Furax augment that makes slash happen on impact often will just be stopped by like having Shock Trooper active or any number of other things, right? So a lot of times what you'll have to do is like just turn everything else off to have it work at all. But you can see that with this much heavy attack efficiency and the stacks from Relentless combination, this build actually ends up sitting pretty high on combo. This isn't going to be necessarily a build as much as it's going to be a mechanic explanation that kind of helped me understand reflect damage a little bit better. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be showing how melee influence like really interacts with reflect damage just in general. So the Scourge, if you've never used this weapon, it basically has a unique trait that if you throw it at the ground, it'll make a mag bubble on people's heads. So for example, if I throw this at a bunch of bombards like this, you'll see that they can actually shoot themselves. Right, so they'll shoot and then it'll explode and hit all the enemies around them. And that is true for basically any projectile that they fire, right? Pretty useful by itself. Just making enemies hit themselves is kind of funny. And especially at higher levels, it'll actually end up killing enemies, which is pretty cool. But what's even cooler about it is that melee influence actually interacts with reflect damage in general, as long as it procs status. One example of this is with these bombards. If I throw this, and then I'm using this Okina with just some electric and some status chance on it, just so we actually can get melee influence to proc, what you'll see is that when these guys shoot at each other, the blast procs will actually spread to everybody else around them, right? Second interaction that I want to talk about is molecular prime and melee influence. If an enemy dies while you have melee influence active with a melee weapon, it actually turns out that the explosions can also proc melee influence, right? So they need to be tagged by a melee weapon, doesn't really matter what it is, and you need to have melee influence active, and then the explosions with their blast procs can also proc melee influence, so it kind of chains on itself, right? So because of that, because melee influence can kind of chain on itself with Nova's 4 active, it turns out that if you start the chain with melee influence, when a reflect damage projectile actually kills somebody, it does the same chaining behavior. And so you can see that this did just a ton of damage as soon as a single bombard died. And so this was not really a build that I came up with. This was just kind of an aha moment for me with why Zada's Whisper Nova is so strong. A big part of it is based on this, right? This idea that like if a bombard shoots anybody and they kill someone, that explosion can then proc melee influence, and then that melee influence chain can basically happen forever. Right. Next is Mind Control Volt. I'm not going to show this in a real mission because if you brought this into a public mission, you'd probably get banned. This is purely academic. Don't bring this into real public missions, okay? The idea here is you can mind control an enemy and you can apply buffs to mind controlled enemies. That's kind of the extent of it. So if I like mind control this guy, I can give him speed, for example, and now he is as fast as I am. You can see that this dude is zooming. And you can actually give him Shocking Touch too. So watch his cleaver here. You can see that he gets the same buff that I do. So you see those blue sparks? That means he has Shock Trooper. So all of his attacks are going to do electric damage. But it turns out there's actually a way to cancel mind control. And that's just by holding down 3. And now he has those buffs, but he's evil. And so this butcher with speed and extra electric damage can attack me. And let me show you what that looks like when I'm not invincible, because I just think this is like the funniest build to ever exist, but also like morally wrong. So like, don't do this. So you can see that I actually got rad procced and electric procced. So if this wasn't bad enough by itself, it also rad procs if like the aura does damage, or if you take damage from the butcher itself. And then it also electric procs from the aura, because if you step into the aura, then you immediately like get hit for that much damage, right? It's very stupid. It's very mean. Don't do this in real like missions. You will get banned. In case you're wondering, I did try this on a bunch of other stuff too. So here's just Gauss. I don't really play much Gauss or Gus or Gauss or however you pronounce it, but you can kind of see where this is going. We just have thermal transfer, and this buff range will give blast damage to the thing that we mind control instead. So here is the idea. We're going to be invincible for this just so they kill each other and not me. We press thermal transfer, and then we can kind of just spam mind control, and the buff will last even after they stop being mind controlled. So all of these enemies are going to have thermal transfer, and that's bad. So this next one is a weapon spotlight. We're going to be talking about Nepheri. So special thing about these daggers, they have this combo right here. And the third attack is these fireballs. Each of these fireballs does half of the normal amount of damage that you would expect from like a melee swing, but it's a little special because what it also has going for it is that it's multiplicative condition overload. If you've heard those words before, I'm not that surprised. Normally it's used these days in the cases of primary weapons and secondary weapons, but this is one of the few melee weapons with a projectile. And so because it has a projectile, we can actually use that same behavior. So condition overload will multiply with like prime pressure point, for example. So if I put this in, these two things would multiply together and it would make a bigger number, which is pretty cool. So in this case, the reason that I wanted to highlight it is because Valkyr's rework gave her a ton of melee damage just base. And so for a lot of melee weapons, which would normally be running condition overload, that melee damage isn't that useful because like you just have condition overload, and if there's a bunch of stacks on something, then like it just wouldn't do that much, right? But it turns out that if you're using a weapon like this, the fireballs will do much more damage on Valkyr than they would on other people because she can run condition overload and she'll have her passive, and you know, like for example, you could use Shock Trooper, and then you have a way to proc influence also, and then it'll spread the heat around, which is really fun. And so this ends up being pretty good just as a weapon for Valkyr in general. That's kind of why I wanted to highlight Nepheri specifically, is just because Valkyr tends to synergize pretty well with it. Also, a lot of weapons that have multiplicative condition overload like this, their projectile tends to be like heat damage or gas damage or blast damage or something like that, right? And so A lot of elemental mods will combine with them weird. Because we have Valkyr here, we can actually roll compress a lot of the things that we normally would have to run on Nepheri into other stats. So in this case, like for example, I could take out Berserker Fury entirely, right? And I could replace this with a Bane mod or anything else because I have enough space, because we have the purple shards on our Valkyr, and then we have the attack speed from her too. And we have, in this case, we have shock, so we don't really need as much elemental damage, and we don't have to put electric in. And so there's like a lot of compression that comes from Valkyr. Okay, this is Fat Valkyr, also known as Chroma. The reason I'm going to be showing Chroma here is because of a very similar mechanic to the Nepheri thing with Valkyr, except this time we're going to be using Okina Incarnon. If you've never seen Okina before, one of the great things about Okina is that it has these daggers that you can see hovering around me right now. And it turns out that if you approach somebody, these daggers will just seek out an enemy, and they will proc 10 stacks of cold on that enemy, right? Another interesting thing about it is that it actually scales with condition overload. So these daggers scale with condition overload, but they don't scale with regular melee damage. And so these daggers that you see getting shot out on Valkyr don't do that much damage. But on Chroma specifically, because he has his 3, which is a universal damage buff. So you see this 905 weapon damage buff right here. This actually does apply to the daggers, which is different from Valkyr, for example. And so we have heat-seeking projectiles that actually do damage, that also freeze things, which is pretty sick. On top of that, Chroma can actually run Warcry also for more attack speed, and then you just turn into, you're just Valkyr. You're just Valkyr, except you're not invincible. But what you replace that with is Elemental Ward, just in the base kit. And if you don't remember, Elemental Ward interacts with melee influence. So if you want to do funny things, I would highly recommend this build with like a Doriga, or just a weapon that procs melee influence like the Okina that scales like this. I believe Akin Brunt also works this way, but I could be wrong about that. You would need to double check for yourself. There are a handful of weapons that work the same way that Okina does, where their projectiles don't scale with normal melee damage, but they do scale with universal weapon damage. So consider it. If you're if you're interested in a build like this, just take a pass on it. This is just a Chroma. Realistically, replace this with a third Umbral mod if you want to. But this is slightly tankier because we are getting armor from Vex Armor and Elemental Ward, and honestly Warcry too, so we have triple armor buffs here, so you really don't need Umbral Fiber in here. So adaptation, I believe, is better. And then the rest of this is just like we're maxing strength and duration, and we don't care about these two. This is what I would recommend on Okina, but realistically, if you want to replace stuff for Viral here instead, I think that's perfectly fine. This next one isn't necessarily a build either. I just kind of wanted to talk about a bug that was found on Oraxia by Ironstash, who's a person who has sent me a lot of Forma in the past, so thank you for that. But also sent me this bug just to show it off. So I wanted to talk about this really quick in this video, and that is that there are some Incarnons that actually benefit from Oraxia's 4 buff. One of those is Xirel. You can actually see down in the corner, we are in fact getting the toxin buff on the UI, and you can see that it does actually work in practice too. You can see that we're getting those toxin hits. So Xirel is probably the strongest one out of the ones that were discovered to have this interaction that like are Incarnons but still get the toxin buff. This one, the Dara and the Sestra were the only ones that seem to have this interaction. So Dara, Sestra, Xirel. There is, however, a way to get Oraxia's buff on all Incarnons, and I'm going to show that real quick too. All right, so we have the Burst in here and the Lex, and neither of these weapons normally can get Oraxia's buff while they are in Incarnon mode. So let me just show that off. If I kill this guy, for example, just so I get the stacks, and then we switch into Incarnon form, you can see that if I go into 4, I don't actually get the Incarnon buff. This just does the regular amount of damage. It doesn't really do the Incarnon part. It's still an insane weapon, so obviously this is going to kill things, but we aren't getting the toxin procs there, right? Well, it turns out that if you have 2 Incarnons equipped, there's actually a way to get them to show up. So right now I don't have either of them, but if I deactivate both of these, so we have the toxin buff, so we're going to stack up on this one, and we're going to stack up on the Lex, and we're going to transform the Lex, and then we're going to transform the Burst in. And whichever Incarnon you activate second will get the toxin buff. So now you can see that we're actually getting the toxin buff on the Burst in Prime, even though like it's not supposed to be able to get it. Very weird bug, but if you're an Oraxia player to any extent, like if you suddenly became an Oraxia main as soon as you came out, this is probably something worth knowing about. Next weapon that we're going to be talking about is the Quanta Vandal. This weapon is good. I didn't really realize how good it was until very recently. 45% status chance per projectile is absolutely bonkers. So I'm just going to try to show this weapon with my Riven, which is status chance, crit damage, just kind of show off how many electric procs this thing can really get going by itself. Important thing to note is that because this thing's Riven disposition is so high, like you can kind of get Riven's dirt cheap also. It's not because the disposition is high, but the disposition is high because it's not popular, right? So this weapon that you're regularly seeing me proc 600 electric status on an enemy is like 20 platter Riven, if that, right? So very, like, it's a very good investment in terms of like weapon to plat ratio, I guess. And another great thing about it is how well it just works with Wisp in general. You don't really want to dilute its status pool at all. Because it's a beam weapon, it caps out at statuses that have 10 max status, so like gas, for example, or viral, really, really quickly. And so you kind of want just a mono element that can stack forever, like electricity. So it's already base electric. We're putting more electric on here so that it doesn't do anything but proc a lot of electric. We have Crux on for more status chance. Now, either Riven is more status chance and then Rifle Elementalist for more damage, right? We are running Wisp with Doriga because if you put a shock mote on Doriga, it will do kind of the exact same thing as Doriga because of the way Manifold Bond interacts with it. So this Manifold Bond precept will actually work on shock motes. So if I give Doriga a shock mote, like you can see it floating around both me and Doriga, the shock mote will also apply like viral and heat and whatever elements that I have modded on my Sentinel. And then we get to run Roar basically for free because we're Wisp. And then together, what we have is priming and then shooting, and then this thing just absolutely evaporates, right? This is very silly. So 9 million damage. This guy's not primed. We did 32 million damage. Highly would recommend it with Wisp. Highly would recommend it with Roar. Highly would recommend it with a primer companion that can carry a shock mote so that you get basically 2 Dorigas. Okay, I think that's it for this video. I didn't get to show the Wisp build in the final segment here because I ran out of time for my 2-minute time limit, but I'm going to cheat right now and I'm just going to flash it on the screen. So there's the Wisp build if you are really curious. Beyond that, hopefully people enjoyed this video. I'm not really sure how well people will like this one. It's a little bit all over the place. And there was a lot of tech here that I kind of glossed over or like didn't explain in full, which I normally would. So if there's questions that you have about some part of the tech, I'll try to go over it as they come up. But beyond that, I don't know. It was fun. I spent a lot of Pharma on this. If you want to send me more Pharma, feel free. But you don't need to. I'm actually doing pretty good on Pharma right now. Like still 50 something. So thank you guys for watching.